The vast oceans of our world have witnessed countless tales of adventure, exploration, and discovery. But beneath the romantic veneer of maritime history lies a darker truth. For centuries, ruthless pirates carved their names into legend through blood, terror, and unimaginable cruelty. These weren't the swashbuckling heroes of Hollywood films. These were real men and women who turned the seas into their personal hunting grounds, leaving devastation in their wake. From the Caribbean's turquoise waters to the treacherous coasts of Madagascar, these maritime predators struck fear into the hearts of merchants, naval officers, and innocent passengers alike. They commanded fleets that could rival national navies, amassed fortunes that would make modern billionaires envious, and developed reputations so terrifying that entire shipping routes were abandoned at the mere mention of their names. What drove these individuals to choose a life of piracy? Was it desperation, greed, or something far more sinister? The stories we're about to explore reveal the shocking truth about 10 of history's most brutal sea rovers. These weren't mere thieves who stole cargo and sailed away. These were calculating predators who perfected the art of psychological warfare, turning torture into a tool of trade and murder into a means of maintaining their reign of terror. The golden age of piracy, spanning roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, created legends that continue to fascinate us today. But the reality was far more horrifying than any fiction could portray. These pirates didn't just steal treasure. They destroyed lives, shattered communities, and turned vast stretches of ocean into maritime graveyards, where the screams of their victims echoed across the waves. Our first tale takes us to the Caribbean during the early 18th century, where a man whose very name became synonymous with terror ruled the seas with an iron fist. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, wasn't just another pirate. He was a master of psychological warfare who understood that fear could be more powerful than any cannon or cutlass. Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a floating fortress armed with 40 guns and crewed by over 300 of the most desperate men the Caribbean had ever seen. But it wasn't his firepower that made him legendary. It was his appearance and the calculated brutality with which he conducted his affairs. Before battle, Blackbeard would weave hemp and slow matches into his massive black beard, lighting them so that his face appeared wreathed in smoke and fire. His eyes would gleam through this hellish mask as he approached his victims, creating an image so terrifying that many ships surrendered without firing a single shot. The stories of Blackbeard's cruelty are numerous and disturbing. He once shot his own quartermaster in the leg simply to remind his crew who was in charge. When the man recovered, Blackbeard explained his actions by saying that if he didn't kill someone every now and then, his men might forget who he was. This wasn't the behaviour of a desperate criminal. This was the calculated psychology of a man who understood that his reputation was his greatest weapon. During one particularly infamous incident near Charleston, South Carolina, Blackbeard blockaded the entire harbour, effectively holding the city hostage. He captured several prominent citizens, including a member of the Colonial Council, and threatened to send their heads to the governor unless his demands were met. For days, no ship could enter or leave the port as Blackbeard's fleet patrolled the waters like hungry sharks. The psychological impact on the city was devastating. Trade ground to a halt, and panic spread through the streets as residents wondered if they would be the next victims of the pirates' wrath. But Blackbeard's most terrifying trait wasn't his violence. It was his unpredictability. He could be charming and sophisticated when it suited his purposes, entertaining prisoners with stories and fine wine before ordering their execution the next morning. This psychological manipulation made him even more dangerous than pirates who relied solely on brute force. His victims never knew what to expect, and this uncertainty became a weapon as sharp as any blade. The end of Blackbeard's reign came in November 1718, when Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy finally cornered the pirate in a fierce battle off the coast of North Carolina. Even in death, Blackbeard's legend grew. It took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts to bring him down, and when Maynard's men finally subdued him, they found his body covered in scars from countless previous battles. His severed head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof that the terror of the Caribbean was finally dead. Moving from the Caribbean to the coast of Wales, our next subject represents a different kind of maritime terror. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was perhaps the most successful pirate in terms of sheer numbers. During his brief but devastating career, which lasted only 3 years, he captured over 400 ships. This wasn't mere piracy, It was systematic maritime warfare conducted with the efficiency of a military campaign. Roberts didn't choose the pirate's life. The life chose him when his merchant vessel was captured by pirates off the coast of Africa in 1719. Within weeks of being forced to join their crew, Roberts had proven himself so capable that he was elected captain after their leader was killed in battle. This rapid rise to power revealed a man with natural leadership abilities and a ruthless pragmatism that would make him one of the most feared names on the high seas. What made Black Bart particularly terrifying was his methodical approach to piracy. While other pirates relied on luck and opportunity, Roberts operated like a naval commander, developing detailed strategies for each attack and maintaining strict discipline among his crews. He created a comprehensive code of conduct for his men, establishing rules that governed everything from the division of loot to the treatment of prisoners. But these weren't humanitarian guidelines. They were tools of efficiency designed to maximize terror and profit. Roberts understood that reputation was everything in the pirate world. He deliberately cultivated an image of invincibility, designing dramatic black flags that featured himself standing on the skulls of his enemies. When he entered a harbour, ships would flee at the sight of his colours, knowing that resistance meant certain death. He once captured 11 ships in a single harbour in Newfoundland, creating such panic that the colonial government issued warnings to all vessels to avoid the area entirely. The psychological warfare employed by Roberts was particularly sophisticated. He would often capture entire crews and force them to watch as he tortured their officers to death, ensuring that survivors would spread word of his brutality to every port they reached. This created a network of terror that preceded him wherever he sailed, making his job easier as merchant captains increasingly chose surrender over certain death. One of Roberts's most notorious acts occurred when he learned that the governor of Martinique had commissioned privateers to hunt him down. In retaliation, he sailed directly to the island's main harbour and began systematically destroying every ship he could find. He burned vessels worth hundreds of thousands of pounds and left the harbour filled with smoking wreckage. But the physical destruction was only part of his revenge. He captured several prominent merchants and subjected them to public torture, ensuring that news of his retaliation would spread throughout the Caribbean. Roberts' reign of terror came to an end in February 1722, when he encountered the Royal Navy ships HMS Swallow and HMS Weymouth off the coast of Africa. Even facing overwhelming odds, Roberts chose to fight rather than flee, demonstrating the same fearlessness that had made him legendary. He died early in the battle, struck down by grape shot while standing defiantly on his ship's deck. His crew, knowing that capture meant certain execution, threw his body overboard to prevent the authorities from displaying it as a trophy. The impact of Roberts's career extended far beyond the ships he captured, or the treasure he stole. He fundamentally changed how maritime trade operated in the Atlantic, forcing merchants to travel in armed convoys and avoid entire regions of ocean. Insurance rates skyrocketed, and some trade routes were abandoned entirely. The economic damage caused by his 3-year campaign of terror took decades to repair. Our journey through maritime horror now takes us to the South China Sea, where a woman named Shisha commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in human history. Known in the West as Madam Ching, she controlled over 1,800 vessels and commanded nearly 80,000 pirates at the height of her power. This wasn't just piracy. This was the creation of a floating empire that challenged the authority of the Chinese imperial government itself. Madam Ching's rise to power began as a tale of survival and ambition. Originally a courtesan, she married Zheng Yi, a powerful pirate leader who had united several rival gangs into a single confederation. When her husband died unexpectedly in 1807, she manoeuvred brilliantly to maintain control over his fleet, eventually becoming the undisputed leader of what was essentially a maritime nation. What made Madame Ching particularly terrifying was the sheer scale of her operations and the systematic way she administered her floating empire. She divided her fleet into different coloured flags, each responsible for specific regions of the Pearl River and South China Sea. The Red Flag fleet alone contained over 300 junks and 20,000 pirates. This level of organisation allowed her to control maritime trade throughout southern China, essentially functioning as a parallel government that collected taxes, issued safe passage permits, and maintained its own legal system. The rules governing Madam Ching's confederation were detailed and ruthlessly enforced. Pirates who raped captives without permission faced execution. Those who deserted were hunted down and killed. Disobedience to orders resulted in ear removal for the first offence and execution for the second. But these weren't arbitrary punishments. They were carefully calculated measures designed to maintain discipline and maximise the fleet's effectiveness as a fighting force. The systematic nature of Madame Qing's operations extended to every aspect of her maritime empire. She established detailed procedures for capturing vessels, processing prisoners, and distributing loot. Her fleet operated sophisticated intelligence networks that provided advance warning of merchant movements and government naval activities. Coastal communities were forced to pay regular tribute or face devastating raids that would leave their harbours in ruins and their populations enslaved. What distinguished Madame Qing from other pirate leaders was her understanding of politics and diplomacy. She negotiated directly with Chinese imperial officials, treating them as equals rather than superiors. When government forces attempted to suppress her fleet, she retaliated by launching coordinated attacks on multiple ports simultaneously, demonstrating that her confederation possessed the strategic capabilities of a legitimate navy. Her forces could blockade entire river systems, cutting off vital trade routes and forcing the imperial government to acknowledge her power. The terror tactics employed by her fleet were particularly refined. Captured merchants faced a horrifying choice: pay ransom immediately or watch as their crew members were slowly tortured to death. Those who couldn't afford the demanded payments were sold into slavery, while their ships were either incorporated into the pirate fleet or destroyed as examples to others. Entire families of wealthy merchants disappeared into her floating prisons, never to be seen again. During the height of her power, Madame Qing's confederation effectively controlled the entire Pearl River Delta, one of China's most economically important regions. Her fleet collected taxes from fishing boats, levied tribute from merchant vessels, and issued official documents that were recognized by coastal communities as legitimate government papers. She had created a shadow state that operated parallel to imperial authority, complete with its own bureaucracy and legal system. The psychological impact of her reign extended throughout the South China Sea. Merchant captains would change their routes by hundreds of miles to avoid areas patrolled by her red flag fleet. Some traders abandoned maritime commerce entirely, choosing to accept financial ruin rather than risk capture by her forces. The mere sight of her distinctive red banners on the horizon was enough to send entire fishing fleets racing back to port in terror. Her eventual negotiation with the Chinese government in 1810 was as remarkable as her rise to power. Rather than face inevitable destruction through continued warfare, she entered into complex diplomatic discussions that ultimately resulted in her amnesty and the integration of many of her followers into the imperial navy. This wasn't surrender. It was a calculated political maneuver that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. From the organized brutality of the South China Sea, we turn our attention to the Indian Ocean, where Captain William Kidd earned infamy as one of history's most controversial maritime figures. What made Kidd particularly terrifying wasn't just his actions, but the way his story revealed how easily the line between legal privateering and outright piracy could be crossed. Kidd began his career as a respectable sea captain and privateer, officially commissioned by the British government to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. His transformation from government agent to wanted criminal illustrates the moral ambiguity that characterized much of maritime law during the late 17th century. But regardless of legal technicalities, the acts he committed against merchant vessels and their crews placed him firmly among history's most ruthless sea predators. The turning point in Kidd's career came during his pursuit of the Quidar Merchant, a massive treasure ship sailing under Armenian colours but carrying French passes. The capture of this vessel marked his transition from questionable privateer to outright pirate. The wealth aboard the ship was staggering, but the methods Kidd used to extract information about hidden treasures from captured crew members were savage beyond description. Witnesses later testified that Kidd personally tortured prisoners, using techniques designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims conscious and able to provide information. He would hang crew members by their thumbs, beat them with rope ends embedded with metal, and force them to watch as their shipmates were slowly mutilated. These weren't the desperate acts of a cornered criminal. They were the calculated methods of a man who had discovered that extreme cruelty could be profitable. What made Kidd's brutality particularly chilling was his ability to maintain a facade of respectability, even while committing atrocities. He continued to correspond with wealthy merchants and government officials, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman forced into difficult circumstances by the complexities of maritime law. This duplicity allowed him to operate in civilized ports while his victims' screams still echoed in his memory. The psychological manipulation employed by Kidd extended beyond physical torture. He would promise mercy to prisoners who cooperated, only to kill them after extracting the information he needed. He understood that hope could be as effective a weapon as fear, using the possibility of survival to encourage victims to betray their comrades and reveal hidden treasures. This combination of false promises and inevitable betrayal created an atmosphere of despair aboard captured vessels that was as devastating as any physical assault. During one particularly notorious incident, Kidd's crew captured a Portuguese ship carrying several wealthy passengers. Rather than simply robbing them and releasing the vessel, Kidd decided to make an example that would enhance his reputation throughout the Indian Ocean. He ordered the passengers brought on deck and announced that they would be executed one by one until the ship's captain revealed the location of additional treasure supposedly hidden aboard the vessel. The captain, desperate to save his passengers, fabricated stories about secret compartments and buried gold, hoping to buy time for rescue or escape. Kidd, however, had no intention of honouring any bargains. He proceeded with the executions anyway, ensuring that survivors would spread word of his ruthlessness to every port they reached. The psychological impact of this calculated cruelty extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating a climate of terror that preceded his ship wherever it sailed. Kidd's downfall came when he returned to American waters, believing that his political connections and accumulated wealth would protect him from prosecution. He had underestimated the changing political climate and the public outrage generated by reports of his activities. His arrest and subsequent trial became a sensation, with newspapers publishing detailed accounts of his alleged crimes that shocked readers throughout the British Empire. The evidence presented during his trial painted a picture of systematic brutality that went far beyond ordinary piracy. Witnesses described scenes of torture and murder that demonstrated a level of cruelty that appalled even hardened maritime officials. His execution in 1701 was attended by massive crowds who came to witness the end of a man whose name had become synonymous with maritime terror. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Kidd's story was how it illustrated the thin line between legal and illegal violence on the high seas. His initial commission from the British government had essentially given him permission to commit acts of violence against enemy vessels that differed from piracy only in their legal authorization. This ambiguity raised troubling questions about the nature of maritime authority and the legitimacy of state-sponsored violence that resonated throughout the Age of Sail. Moving from the ambiguous legalities of privateering to the pure savagery of outlaw piracy, we encounter François l'Olonnais, a French buccaneer whose cruelty was so extreme that it shocked even his fellow pirates. Operating primarily in the Caribbean during the 1660s, l'Olonnais earned a reputation for brutality that made him one of the most feared men in the New World. What distinguished l'Olonnais from other pirates wasn't just his willingness to use violence, but his apparent enjoyment of inflicting suffering on his victims. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who took genuine pleasure in torture, often prolonging the agony of his prisoners long after they had provided all useful information. This wasn't strategic cruelty designed to enhance his reputation. This was sadism elevated to an art form. The methods employed by l'Olonnais were so horrific that even hardened buccaneers refused to sail under his command. He would cut out the tongues of prisoners who refused to speak, then force them to watch as he slowly dismembered their comrades. His preferred technique involved slicing open a victim's chest and pulling out their heart while they were still alive, a practice that earned him the nickname the Flail of the Spaniards among Spanish colonial authorities. During his most infamous raid on the Venezuelan port of Maracaibo, l'Olonnais captured the entire town and subjected its inhabitants to weeks of systematic torture. He wasn't searching for treasure or strategic information. He was simply indulging his appetite for human suffering. Survivors later testified that he would spend hours devising new methods of inflicting pain, treating torture as a form of entertainment rather than a means to an end. The psychological impact of l'Olonnais extended far beyond his immediate victims. Spanish authorities issued warnings throughout the Caribbean describing his methods in graphic detail, hoping to prepare their citizens for what they might face if captured. But these warnings had the unintended effect of amplifying his reputation for cruelty, making his name a source of terror that could clear harbours and empty towns at the mere rumour of his approach. What made L'Ollonais particularly dangerous was his complete unpredictability. Unlike other pirates who followed certain codes of conduct or showed mercy to those who surrendered quickly, he recognized no rules except his own twisted desires. Prisoners who cooperated fully might still face prolonged torture, while those who resisted could find themselves subjected to even more creative forms of suffering. This randomness created an atmosphere of hopelessness that broke the spirits of his victims before physical torture even began. His reign of terror came to an appropriately grim end when his ship ran aground on the coast of Central America. Local indigenous peoples, who had heard stories of his cruelty from Spanish survivors, captured him and his remaining crew. According to legend, they subjected him to the same kinds of tortures he had inflicted on countless others, ensuring that his death was as prolonged and agonizing as those of his victims. Sailing northward from the Caribbean's blood-soaked waters, we encounter another figure whose name became synonymous with maritime terror. Edward Lowe operated during the 1720s and earned a reputation for savage unpredictability that made even Blackbeard appear restrained by comparison. What distinguished Lowe from other pirates wasn't just his cruelty, but his complete inability to control his violent impulses. Lowe's background revealed early signs of the monster he would become. Born into poverty in London, he had exhibited violent tendencies from childhood, engaging in brutal fights that often left his opponents permanently maimed. When he eventually made his way to the American colonies, these violent inclinations found their perfect outlet in piracy, where his savage nature could be channeled into profitable terror. The transformation of Lowe from common criminal to maritime nightmare began when he joined the crew of a pirate vessel, operating off the coast of Honduras. Within months, his reputation for extreme violence had earned him command of his own ship, and he quickly assembled a crew of men who shared his appetite for brutality. These weren't desperate sailors forced into piracy by circumstances. These were individuals who actively sought opportunities to inflict suffering on others. Lowe's methods were characterized by their complete randomness and excessive cruelty. He would sometimes order the execution of entire crews simply because their appearance displeased him. During one documented incident, he forced a captured ship's cook to eat the ears of his own captain after cutting them off with a rusty knife. This wasn't strategic intimidation. This was violence for its own sake, elevated to levels that defied rational explanation. The unpredictability that made Lowe so terrifying also made him nearly impossible to negotiate with or appease. Merchant captains who had successfully bargained with other pirates found themselves facing a man who seemed to derive more pleasure from killing than from any treasure he might obtain. His crew learned to avoid him during his violent moods, knowing that his rage could turn on them just as easily as on prisoners. During his most notorious period of activity along the American coast, Lowe captured dozens of vessels and subjected their crews to tortures that contemporary accounts described as beyond human imagination. He would force fathers to watch as their sons were slowly dismembered, then kill the fathers anyway. He delighted in creating situations where prisoners had to choose which of their comrades would die first, then would kill them all regardless of their decisions. What made Lowe's cruelty particularly disturbing was its complete lack of purpose. Other pirates used violence as a tool to maintain discipline, extract information, or enhance their reputations. Lowe simply enjoyed causing pain, and his actions often worked against his own interests by making potential victims more likely to fight to the death rather than surrender. His psychological state deteriorated noticeably during his final months of activity. Crew members later testified that he would spend hours talking to the severed heads of his victims, carrying on conversations with corpses as if they were still alive. This descent into apparent madness made him even more unpredictable and dangerous, as his already tenuous grip on reality continued to weaken. The end of Lowe's career remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claim he was marooned by his own crew, who had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behaviour. Others suggest he died in a fight with French naval vessels off the coast of Martinique. But perhaps the most fitting end to his story comes from reports that he was captured by indigenous peoples and subjected to ritual tortures that lasted for days, finally experiencing the same prolonged suffering he had inflicted on so many others. From the chaotic violence of Edward Lowe, we turn to examine a different kind of maritime terror. Henry Every, known as the King of Pirates, represented a more calculating form of brutality that combined strategic thinking with ruthless execution. Operating during the 1690s, Every masterminded one of the most profitable pirate raids in history, while simultaneously demonstrating levels of cruelty that shocked even his contemporaries. Every's background was notably different from many other pirates of his era. He possessed genuine nautical skills and had served as a legitimate naval officer before turning to piracy. This professional competence made him far more dangerous than pirates who relied solely on brute force or luck. He understood ship design, navigation, and naval tactics, knowledge that he used to devastating effect against his victims. The raid that made Every legendary occurred in 1695 when his fleet intercepted the Ganges Sawai, a massive treasure ship belonging to the Mughal Emperor of India. The vessel was carrying an enormous fortune in gold, silver, and precious gems, making it one of the richest prizes ever captured by pirates. But the treasure was only part of the story. The methods. Every use to extract information about hidden wealth revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Rather than simply torturing prisoners at random, Every developed systematic approaches to breaking their resistance. He would begin by executing a few crew members in front of the others, establishing the stakes involved. Then he would select prisoners strategically, targeting those who appeared to have knowledge of the ship's cargo or hidden compartments. His techniques combined physical pain with psychological pressure in ways that proved devastatingly effective. The treatment of the Ganges Sawai's passengers revealed Every's particular brand of calculated cruelty. Fed their families, including women's ship carried several wealthy merchants and children who had no knowledge of maritime affairs. Every understood that their suffering could be used as leverage against crew members who might otherwise resist interrogation. The screams of innocent passengers became weapons in his arsenal of terror. Contemporary accounts describe scenes aboard the captured vessel that shocked even hardened sailors. Every would force crew members to watch as passengers were subjected to increasingly brutal treatment, making it clear that cooperation was the only way to end the suffering. But even those who provided information weren't spared, as Every had learned that keeping his word would only encourage future resistance. The systematic nature of Every's approach extended beyond individual raids to his overall strategy as a pirate leader. He carefully selected his targets based on detailed intelligence about their cargo and defensive capabilities. He maintained networks of informants in major ports who provided advance warning about valuable shipments. This level of organization made his fleet far more effective than typical pirate bands that relied on chance encounters. Every's understanding of international politics also set him apart from other pirates. He recognized that attacking Mughal shipping would provoke a diplomatic crisis between India and European colonial powers, potentially disrupting normal naval patrols and creating opportunities for further raids. The chaos generated by his actions served his purposes perfectly, allowing him to operate with reduced interference from legitimate naval forces. The psychological warfare employed by Every was particularly sophisticated. He would deliberately allow some survivors from each attack to escape, knowing they would spread word of his methods throughout maritime communities. These survivors became unwilling agents of terror, their testimonies creating an atmosphere of fear that preceded his fleet wherever it sailed. Ship captains began surrendering at the first sight of his colours, preferring certain robbery to probable death. The wealth accumulated during Every's career was staggering, but the human cost was equally immense. Estimates suggest that his fleet was responsible for the deaths of thousands of sailors, passengers, and coastal inhabitants throughout the Indian Ocean. Entire communities abandoned their ports when rumours circulated that his ships had been spotted in nearby waters. Every's ultimate fate remains one of piracy's greatest mysteries. Unlike other notorious pirates who met violent ends, he appears to have successfully retired from his criminal career and disappeared into anonymity. Some historians believe he used his accumulated wealth to purchase respectability in colonial America, while others suggest he returned to England under an assumed identity. This successful escape added another layer to his legend, proving that intelligence and planning could triumph over brute force. The legacy of Henry Every extended far beyond his individual crimes. His success inspired countless imitators who attempted to replicate his methods, leading to an explosion of organized piracy throughout the Indian Ocean. The diplomatic crises generated by his attacks on Mughal shipping forced European powers to reconsider their naval policies in Asian waters, ultimately leading to increased military presence and more aggressive anti-piracy measures. Our exploration of maritime terror now takes us to the Mediterranean, where the Barbary corsairs created a system of state-sponsored piracy that terrorized European shipping for centuries. Among these North African pirates, Hayreddin Barbarossa stands out as perhaps the most successful and brutal, combining political ambition with ruthless maritime warfare to create an empire built on human suffering. Barbarossa's rise to power began in the early 16th century, when he and his brother established themselves as corsair leaders operating from bases along the North African coast. What distinguished them from ordinary pirates was their ability to combine maritime raiding with territorial conquest, eventually controlling substantial portions of the Mediterranean coastline and turning piracy into an instrument of imperial policy. The methods employed by Barbarossa went far beyond simple robbery at sea. His fleets would descend upon coastal villages without warning, capturing entire populations for sale in North African slave markets. These raids were characterized by their systematic brutality, designed not just to gather human cargo but to terrorize entire regions into submission. The psychological impact was devastating, forcing coastal communities throughout the Mediterranean to abandon their homes or live in constant fear. What made Barbarossa particularly terrifying was the industrial scale of his slave-taking operations. His fleets could capture thousands of people in a single raid, processing them through sophisticated networks that transported human cargo across the Mediterranean and into the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't opportunistic crime, but systematic exploitation that treated human beings as commodities to be harvested and sold. The treatment of captured Europeans revealed the calculated nature of Barbarossa's cruelty. Those who might bring high ransoms were kept in relatively good condition and allowed to send letters to their families describing their plight. But those deemed less valuable faced immediate sale into brutal slavery, often disappearing forever into the markets of Constantinople or Tunis. This selective mercy created hope among some prisoners, while condemning others to hopeless despair. Barbarossa's political acumen made him even more dangerous than typical pirates. He successfully negotiated alliances with the Ottoman Empire, transforming his corsair fleet into an official naval force that could operate under the protection of one of the world's major powers. This legitimacy allowed him to expand his operations dramatically, while making it difficult for European powers to retaliate effectively. The systematic nature of his operations extended to every aspect of his maritime empire. He established permanent bases along the North African coast, complete with shipyards, armories, and slave markets. His intelligence networks provided detailed information about European shipping schedules and coastal defences. He even developed diplomatic European powers, playing relationships with some of them against each other to maximise his operational freedom. The human cost of Barbarossa's career was immense, with estimates suggesting that his forces captured over 1 million Europeans during his lifetime. Entire regions of the Mediterranean were effectively depopulated as coastal communities fled inland to escape his raids. The economic impact was equally devastating, as maritime trade routes were abandoned and insurance costs skyrocketed throughout the region. The psychological warfare tactics employed by Barbarossa extended beyond immediate terror to long-term strategic manipulation. He would deliberately release certain prisoners after months or years of captivity, knowing they would return to their home communities bearing detailed accounts of the horrors they had witnessed. These survivors became unwilling ambassadors of fear, their testimonies spreading throughout Europe and amplifying his reputation far beyond the actual reach of his fleets. The sophistication of Barbarossa's slave trade operations revealed the industrial nature of his enterprise. He established processing centres where captured Europeans were sorted according to their potential value, with skilled craftsmen, young women, and children commanding premium prices in Ottoman markets. Those deemed unsuitable for profitable sale faced immediate execution or were condemned to the galleys, where their lives were measured in months rather than years. What distinguished Barbarossa from other corsair leaders was his understanding of European politics and his ability to exploit religious divisions for his own benefit. He would time his raids to coincide with European conflicts, knowing that potential victims would be distracted by wars closer to home. He also cultivated relationships with French officials who saw his activities as useful weapons against their Spanish and Italian enemies, creating a complex web of semi-official support that protected his operations. The transformation of captured Europeans into Ottoman galley slaves represented one of the most horrific aspects of Barbarossa's system. These unfortunate souls were chained to rowing benches in conditions that defied human description, forced to power the very ships that would capture more of their countrymen. The mortality rate among galley slaves was so high that constant replacement was necessary, creating an endless demand for fresh captives that fueled ever more aggressive raiding. Barbarossa's eventual integration into the Ottoman naval hierarchy as Kapudan Pasha, or Grand Admiral, legitimized his activities on an unprecedented scale. His appointment transformed what had been criminal enterprise into state policy, allowing him to command resources that dwarfed anything available to independent pirates. This official status also provided diplomatic protection that made retaliation by European powers extremely difficult without risking broader conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. The cultural impact of Barbarossa's reign of terror extended far beyond his immediate victims. European coastal communities developed elaborate warning systems and defensive measures that fundamentally altered their way of life. Watchtowers were constructed along vulnerable coastlines, local militias were formed and trained, and entire populations participated in regular drills designed to respond to corsair raids. The Mediterranean, once a highway of peaceful trade, became a militarized frontier where every ship movement was viewed with suspicion. From the organized brutality of the Barbary corsairs, we turn our attention to the Pacific, where another form of maritime terror emerged among the pirates of Southeast Asia. Koh-Sing-Ye, known to European sources as Koxinga, operated during the mid-17th century and demonstrated how traditional piracy could evolve into something approaching modern insurgency warfare. Koxinga's background differed significantly from typical pirates, as he began his career as a legitimate military commander fighting against the Manchu conquest of China. His transformation into what European observers considered a pirate occurred when his political cause became hopeless, forcing him to adapt his military skills to maritime predation. This combination of professional military training with desperate circumstances created a particularly dangerous form of sea rover. The methods employed by Koxinga revealed the influence of his military background on his piratical activities. Rather than simply attacking individual merchant vessels, he would coordinate massive fleet operations that resembled full naval campaigns. His forces would blockade entire regions, cutting off trade routes and forcing local authorities to negotiate tribute payments in exchange for safe passage. This strategic approach to piracy represented a significant evolution from the opportunistic raids typical of earlier sea rovers. What made Koxinga particularly formidable was his ability to combine traditional Chinese naval tactics with knowledge gained from captured European vessels. His fleet incorporated advanced artillery and navigation techniques while maintaining the speed and maneuverability advantages of traditional Asian ship designs. This hybrid approach gave his forces significant advantages over both European colonial navies and traditional pirate bands operating in the same waters. The psychological impact of Koxinga's operations extended throughout the South China Sea and beyond. His fleet's distinctive war junks became symbols of terror for merchant captains throughout the region, their appearance on the horizon sufficient to send entire convoys fleeing toward the nearest fortified port. The systematic nature of his attacks created an atmosphere of uncertainty that disrupted trade patterns throughout Southeast Asia. Koxinga's treatment of prisoners reflected his military background and political motivations. Unlike pirates who were primarily interested in ransom or slave labor, he would often execute captured European officials as symbols of his resistance to foreign influence in Chinese waters. These public executions served both political and psychological purposes, demonstrating his power while terrorizing potential opponents. The scale of Koxinga's operations rivaled those of legitimate naval powers, with his fleet at its peak comprising over 3,000 vessels of various sizes. This massive force allowed him to control vast stretches of ocean and effectively challenge the authority of both the Manchu government and European colonial powers. His ability to maintain such a large fleet required sophisticated logistical systems that resembled those of established navies, rather than typical pirate organizations. The economic warfare conducted by Koxinga extended beyond simple piracy to systematic disruption of trade networks. His forces would target key commercial routes and strategic ports, creating economic chaos that served his political objectives while generating enormous profits. This combination of ideological motivation with criminal enterprise made him particularly dangerous to established authorities. Moving from the political complexities of Asian piracy to the raw brutality of Caribbean buccaneers, we encounter Roche Brasiliano, a Dutch pirate whose sadistic tendencies made him notorious even among his fellow criminals. Operating during the 1660s and 1670s, Brasiliano represented the worst aspects of piratical culture, combining alcoholism with extreme violence to create a reign of terror that shocked contemporary observers. Brazilian's background revealed early signs of the monster he would become. Born in the Netherlands, he had migrated to Brazil as a young man before eventually making his way to the Caribbean, where his violent tendencies found their perfect outlet among the international community of pirates and buccaneers operating from bases like Port Royal and Tortuga. His reputation for unpredictable brutality quickly earned him command of his own vessel. What distinguished Brasiliano from other pirates wasn't just his cruelty, but his complete lack of self-control when under the influence of alcohol, which was unfortunately most of the time. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who would fly into homicidal rages at the slightest provocation, often turning his violence against his own crew members as readily as against captured enemies. This unpredictability made him extremely dangerous to everyone around him. The methods employed by Brasiliano were characterized by their excessive and apparently purposeless cruelty. He would roast Spanish prisoners alive on spits, not to extract information or intimidate others, but simply because their nationality triggered his violent impulses. These acts of torture were often prolonged for hours, while Brasiliano consumed enormous quantities of rum, his sadistic pleasure increasing with his level of intoxication. His hatred of Spanish colonists became legendary throughout the Caribbean, leading to systematic campaigns of terror against Spanish settlements and shipping. Brasiliano would specifically seek out Spanish vessels, subjecting their crews to tortures that contemporary sources described as beyond human imagination. His particular hatred seemed to stem from some unknown personal grievance, but its expression knew no bounds or limitations. The psychological impact of Brasiliano's activities extended far beyond his immediate victims. Spanish authorities issued specific warnings about his methods, hoping to prepare their citizens for what they might face if captured. However, these detailed descriptions of his torture techniques had the unintended effect of amplifying his reputation throughout the region, making his name synonymous with uncontrolled savagery. What made Brasiliano particularly dangerous was his complete indifference to the consequences of his actions. Unlike other pirates who calculated the risks and benefits of their violence, he seemed driven by impulses that he made no effort to control. This recklessness led to increasingly bold attacks that brought unwanted attention from colonial authorities, while alienating potential allies among other pirate crews. His treatment of prisoners revealed the depths of his sadistic nature. Rather than killing victims quickly, he would devise elaborate tortures that prolonged their suffering for maximum effect. These weren't interrogation techniques designed to extract information, but expressions of pure malice that served no rational purpose beyond satisfying his twisted desires. The end of Brasiliano's career came when his own crew, tired of his erratic behavior and concerned about the attention his excesses were attracting from naval forces, abandoned him during a raid on a Spanish settlement. Left without support, he was captured by Spanish soldiers who subjected him to the same kinds of tortures he'd inflicted on countless others. His execution was attended by crowds of survivors from his previous attacks, who had travelled considerable distances to witness the death of their tormentor. Our final examination of maritime terror takes us back to the Caribbean during the early 18th century, where Charles Vane operated as one of the most psychologically disturbed pirates of his era. Unlike other sea rovers who committed violence for profit or strategic advantage, Vane seemed to derive genuine pleasure from inflicting suffering on others, making him one of the most feared figures of the golden age of piracy. Vane's rise to prominence began during the chaotic period following the War of Spanish Succession, when unemployed sailors and discharged soldiers throughout the Caribbean turned to piracy as their primary means of survival. His natural leadership abilities and complete ruthlessness quickly elevated him to command his own vessel, but his methods were extreme even by the standards of his brutal profession. What made Vane particularly terrifying wasn't just his personal cruelty, but his ability to inspire similar behaviour in his crew members. Under his leadership, ordinary sailors transformed into sadistic monsters who competed with each other to devise increasingly horrific tortures for their victims. This collective descent into barbarism created an atmosphere aboard his ship that contemporary observers compared to visions of hell itself. The systematic nature of Vane's brutality revealed a calculating intelligence behind his apparent madness. He would deliberately prolong the suffering of prisoners, not just for his own entertainment, but to create survivors who would spread word of his methods throughout the Caribbean. These testimonies of horror preceded his ship wherever it sailed, often causing merchant vessels to surrender without resistance, rather than face the certainty of prolonged torture. Vane's psychological manipulation of his victims was particularly sophisticated. He would offer hope of survival to prisoners who provided information about other ships or hidden treasures, only to subject them to even worse tortures once he'd extracted what he needed. This combination of false promises and inevitable betrayal broke the spirits of his victims more effectively than simple violence alone. The impact of Vane's career extended far beyond the ships he captured or the treasure he accumulated. His reputation for extreme cruelty forced changes in maritime insurance rates and shipping patterns throughout the Caribbean. Some trade routes were abandoned entirely rather than risk encounter with his vessel, while others required armed escorts that significantly increased transportation costs. His eventual capture and execution in 1721 marked the end of one of piracy's most disturbing chapters, but the psychological scars left by his activities continued to influence Caribbean maritime culture for decades afterward. The memory of his cruelty served as a reminder of how quickly civilization could collapse when removed from the restraining influence of law and social order. These 10 figures represent only the most notorious examples of the countless pirates who terrorized the world's oceans during the golden age of maritime predation. Their stories reveal the depths of human cruelty when freed from moral constraints and legal consequences. They transformed vast stretches of ocean into hunting grounds, where the screams of victims echoed across the waves, leaving behind legacies of terror that continue to fascinate and horrify us centuries later. The psychological warfare, systematic brutality, and calculated cruelty employed by these maritime predators created an atmosphere of fear that fundamentally altered global trade patterns and forced entire civilizations to adapt their way of life around the threat of piratical attack. Their influence extended far beyond the immediate damage they caused, reshaping international law, naval strategy, and maritime culture in ways that continue to resonate in our modern world. The transformation of peaceful merchant sailors into instruments of terror wasn't merely a matter of circumstances forcing desperate men into criminal acts. These individuals possessed psychological traits that predisposed them toward extreme violence, traits that found their perfect expression in the lawless environment of the high seas. The isolation of maritime life, combined with the absence of legal authority beyond the horizon, created conditions where the darkest aspects of human nature could flourish without restraint. What emerges from studying these 10 figures is a disturbing pattern of escalating brutality that suggests something more sinister than simple greed or survival instinct. Each of these pirates developed increasingly sophisticated methods of inflicting suffering, refining their techniques through repeated practice until torture became an art form. They didn't simply steal and kill, they created elaborate rituals of violence that served psychological purposes far beyond any practical considerations. The geographical spread of their activities reveals how maritime terror became a global phenomenon that transcended cultural and national boundaries. From the Atlantic to the tropical Lajersea waters of the Northoons of Southeast Asia, these predators adapted their methods to local conditions while maintaining the same core principles of systematic intimidation and calculated cruelty. Their success inspired imitators throughout the world, creating networks of violence that operated across vast distances and diverse societies. The economic impact of their activities extended far beyond the immediate value of stolen cargo or captured vessels. Entire industries were forced to restructure their operations around the threat of piratical attack, leading to innovations in ship design, navigation techniques, and defensive strategies that influenced maritime development for centuries. Insurance companies developed new models of risk assessment, while merchants created elaborate systems of coded communication to share intelligence about pirate movements. Perhaps most disturbing is how these individuals managed to attract followers willing to participate in their atrocities. The crews that served under these notorious captains weren't merely desperate men seeking survival. They were often willing participants in acts of extreme cruelty, suggesting that the capacity for such behavior exists more widely within human nature than we might prefer to acknowledge. The transformation of ordinary sailors into instruments of terror reveals uncomfortable truths about how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate when social constraints are removed. The psychological techniques employed by these pirates demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human motivation and fear. They recognized that reputation could be more powerful than physical force, developing personal brands of terror that preceded them across the oceans. The careful cultivation of their fearsome images through deliberate acts of extreme violence shows how they understood the strategic value of psychological warfare long before it became a recognized military doctrine. Their ability to maintain discipline among crews composed of criminals and outcasts reveals remarkable leadership skills that were channeled toward destructive purposes. These weren't chaotic gangs of desperate men, but organized military units capable of coordinating complex operations across vast distances. The fact that such organizational abilities were directed toward predation rather than legitimate enterprise represents one of history's most tragic wastes of human potential. The technological innovations developed by pirate crews often matched or exceeded those of legitimate naval forces, demonstrating how criminal enterprises could drive advancement when survival depended on tactical superiority. Modified ship designs, improved artillery techniques, and enhanced navigation methods pioneered by pirates were eventually adopted by official navies, showing how the pressure of maritime warfare accelerated technological progress regardless of its moral implications. The international response to piratical threats reveals how these individual criminals managed to influence global politics and diplomatic relations. Treaties were negotiated, naval alliances were formed, and entire foreign policies were shaped around the need to combat maritime predation. The fact that individual pirates could force major powers to reconsider their strategic priorities demonstrates the enormous impact these figures had on world history. The stories of these 10 ruthless pirates reveal a dark chapter in maritime history that continues to haunt our understanding of human nature itself. Their legacy extends far beyond the treasure they plundered or the ships they destroyed, fundamentally reshaping how we comprehend the capacity for organized evil that exists within seemingly ordinary individuals. These weren't mythical monsters or fictional villains, but real people whose calculated brutality transformed the world's oceans into theaters of unimaginable terror, leaving scars on maritime culture that persist to this day.